Hello, everyone. Apparently, there's been a change in the program. On the program, it says that the transportation leaves from Stias to Longridge Wine Estates. The information that you received in the letters supersedes this. So the plan is directly after the session, there will be shuttles leaving from Stias going to your respective hotels, and then at 6 o'clock, shuttles will pick you up there and take you to the dinner venue. So that's the new information, and that should be the information that you received in the letters, the individualized letters. All right, thank you.
All right. So why don't I repeat that? So we seem to be going back to our accommodation first, and then we're going to the wine estate later. Okay, good. Well, we are here between you and the wine estate, so it's a bit of a hard act to follow. So we have a panel that wants to talk about issues to do with the policy side of it. You know, the way researchers and our research and research in recent times has been impacting on policy or not for that matter. And maybe discuss a little bit more around that. I'm going to introduce the panel, but I'm actually, even though I'm chairing it, I was instructed or also asked to do a bit of a presentation. So all four of us will talk from our perspectives, how we're actually seeing what's going on around research and policy interaction. And I will do that, actually briefly introduce my co-panelists. So I have here Guma from the National Treasury here in South Africa. She's leading the work on economics, economic research. I think that's, what do I call it? Economic policy. Economic reforms. Okay, it's reforms. Apologies. I should have remembered better. We have Andrew Dabalen, who's the chief economist for Africa in the World Bank, and very experienced working already also in other parts of the World Bank, and he will bring his perspective. And of course, many of you will also know very well Ernest Aryeetey from the University of Ghana, and a collaborator of some of the people here in the room as well. So we all have somewhat a different perspective and a different experience around it. And I wouldn't mind getting my slides up already so that we can actually talk. And I want to try to, okay, hopefully I'll challenge you, and hopefully I'll say something useful, and maybe, and hopefully also you disagree with some of the things, so we'll have later on a really interesting discussion, because we have a reasonable amount of time. And we'll see whether we'll need to use it. But basically, there will be presentations, but they're actually really meant to be a kind of a general discussion around these things. And the first thing I want to start with is actually saying, you know, research should not necessarily have a policy impact, okay? And it's just important to repeat. And I don't repeat that because, you know, most of the researchers that we're flowing in, they understand that, and we have incentives that are often related to the research and not narrowly focused on the policy side as well. However, one of my big bugbears when I go around African universities is that any funding that they ever get has to have a policy impact. And actually, it's one of these really sad things in many, and I'm not saying it's here, but in many universities in Kenya, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, there's a lot of incentives there all the time. You know, you'll get some funding, but it has to have a policy impact. And actually, I want to make the case in the first instance, it shouldn't be all the time the case. And in fact, it's one of the important things for building up the capacity in African universities that they can do research for knowledge, just for knowledge, for building it up. Having said that, I'm very interested, and I spent the last 10 years working much more in the policy interface, you know, working for many years, for 7 years as chief economist at DFID. I think one way or another, I did sign many of the checks that will have funded many people's research here, you know, and I'm tempted to say it's virtually anyone here almost will have had one way or another, VIPEDAL, IGC, JPAL directly, IPA directly, and whatever it is. Okay, so there's a lot of funding involved in that. But it is still an important question to ask, and in fact, a lot of these applications for funding that came to, say, a place like DFID said we do it also because we want to have a policy impact. It was not a research council thing. And I just want to reflect a little bit on that experience, but also ask ourselves whether we're asking the questions well enough and whether we actually are generating the evidence well enough around whether some of these things actually have the impact that we get. And so I want to put it here so a little bit, again with a disclaimer, not all research needs to fit into that policy impact, but, many of us, and I think there's many of you here, that actually would like to have impact from their research. There's many people that I know are passionate about development, and they would like to see impact. So you can think of it here on the supply side and the demand side, that we can look at it as well. And, I would argue, and the first argument I would make, we've spent much more time on improving the way we supply the research than actually thinking carefully about, well, what is that demand side? Do we actually properly think about it? And I will want to make a few points. We actually have improved a lot. I was delighted to see a lot of people were using World in Data as the way of representing their data, and it's a fabulous way of doing it. It's my Oxford colleague Max Rosa who inspires it all, and a massive team doing that, but it's really helpful. Of course, there's other initiatives that have been taken. I will, really explicitly mention VoxDevLit, Tavneet here, also the people from VoxDev, Robin and Chris Woodruff, crucially to actually beginning to do something. When I was at DFID, one of the big weaknesses is that we felt like research wasn't being synthesized in the same way as research was synthesized from the sciences. The medical people, they all had careful synthesis things, and there were no incentives for us to do it. And I know this is now based on persuasion and soft incentives, but it's actually quite amazing what we have now. And VoxDevLit, for those who actually haven't looked at it, a really massive source of information. There's other things as well that we actually beginning to get research. And I just can't, where's Jonas sitting there? Someone, Jonas is hiding, maybe he's having a cup of tea. But Jonas has then also begun to do some of the research in terms of, if we supply research, in this case in Brazil, it starts having impact. So and it has impact there in the municipalities in Brazil. It is, and I will come back to that, it is research around tax, and municipalities like to collect more taxes because they have more money to control. So it's maybe the easier ways of doing it, but we're getting bits of evidence. We also know an endless research and early work by Jakob and others was doing that, and Mike Callan recently again, supplying information to local authorities in Pakistan here. It has impact and so on. So we're doing better at the supply of data and evidence. Okay, there's definitely been a big improvement. I think many of us have learned, and often when heated conversations is, how do we get better impact from policymakers? Well, we need to engage early. And of course, then JPAL, IGC has ways of engaging with policymakers that clearly is helping on the supply side. It's there. But it's an interesting thing when you start looking at some of the more recent evidence, not so much in developing countries, and maybe I've missed some of these things, but there's interesting paper by Stefano della Vigna and others in the US, that actually even if you do the RCTs together with some local authority in the US, only 23% actually do anything with it. And so, it's not quite having that impact if it's not in the US. But it's interesting if you contrast it with the place of policy experimentation, where everybody tried, that's how they did it. This recent paper by Wang and David Yang, and it's interesting, we're actually saying, well, even in China, there was basically almost like an experimental effect in the sense that the places where they experimented, they were meant to be the ones where there's more chance for success, and at the same time, extra effort would put in to be successful, and the central government would then not necessarily use that. So there were these effects there as well, that actually it's not quite working in the way that we've been told in our stories about China either. So, but that's all, it's still a hard one to actually pick up. So my question is a bit like, how do we improve that interface maybe? And I want to talk a little, not more about, and I think many of you have mentioned it. Dean was talking about it at length also at UCT, about it, issues to do with external validity and larger scale evidence and so on, and multiple try it out, IPA setting out to actually do it more. Okay, we know that bit, and that's a good thing to do. I want to actually make sure that we also put on the thing, and I'll say a bit more, that's one of the points I will expand on, is are we thinking enough about implementation when we're trying things out for efficacy, okay? And so I'll come back to that. John List was recently writing about it as well. And it's a bit like, maybe we focus too much on what to do and not so much on how to get it done. Definitely working inside the government, a very little attention tends to be paid on how to actually get it done. We have a problem, this is a solution, and then nothing quite seems to happen, and try to understand that a bit more. I also want to emphasize what limits demand, okay? And I think that a lot of times, at least it's one of my bugbears from experience from dealing with different places, including in the UK government, often governments or bureaucracies is not really that interested in development or growth. They're actually not really that interested. And we tend to assume and offering evidence, but actually maybe fundamentally they don't really care. And we, for various reasons, could be ideology. You could be convinced, if I'm allowed to say, convinced in South Africa the route from development must come through industrial policy manufacturing. There's nothing you can ever say on services. You can't talk about the informal sector in a way because there is a commitment, that's the ideology that it would be. I can be wrong and I'm happy to be corrected. But it also could be about, beliefs and preferences. And I'll tell you a few examples in a moment, even in the UK. And of course, we're dealing with bureaucracies. There are rent-seeking maybe there as well. And then actually another one that actually a lot of people always say, but I want to talk about evidence, but it needs to be delivered before the election in 7 months. And what can you offer me that needs to be in 7 months? So political cycles and short-term thinking is there. Now, what I want to actually do in the rest of the introductory notes, or at least my contribution here, is to actually try to list a couple of ideas around, how would we deal with some of these challenges. Not the ones that we know about, but some of these other challenges. And so I'll do about implementation, about somehow the objectives and thinking through there, and then actually a little bit about dealing with these taste things and so on. And the latter thing, I'll try to actually more suggest what I think my tricks were, and I'm not saying I was successful, I can't prove it, but the tricks that I've learned to use inside bureaucracies, or maybe getting a bit more attention. It's basically taking a bit of behavioral science and using it on my ministers. And basically, how can I do that? So I will try to talk about that as well. So first of all, on implementation and scale. So our standard model, I would say, is efficacy testing, okay? And it's the right thing to do. It's an interesting thing. We definitely learn about. We learn about the problems of the poor, and if we do interventions, then that actually may change something, the efficacy of this particular testing. And maybe 20 years ago, or 10 years ago at least, the model would have been, we test it, and now we try to convince them to use it, okay? So we've definitely learned that occasionally it may happen, but it's not always. But we've done this better and better. Initially, we talked a lot about benefits and we forgot about costs. We talk more about external validity. We're talking more about cost curves with scaling. Would the cost curve be linear and the same way, and so on. And you're beginning to get here and there also tests at scale that probably outside India, I can't quite see it happening, but maybe it will happen, and it can happen maybe as well. The innovation, I think, is definitely there, that actually, to overcome some of these problems, do the experiments like Karthik Muralidharan and so on, and Paul Niehaus have written about, carefully, do it at a very large scale. But of course, the opportunities to do that will be relatively limited. There's not that many things where you could really do this. There's other people that say, and in education, Noah Mangrist and Rachel Meager have been writing about, well, actually, we should take the efficacy, but then we should tweak it while we scale with A/B testing, and we'll try things out and doing it. And I think there's some interesting stuff, and I think more is to be done, and I know more is happening around it. But I want to actually make a few points on this. Maybe we should think a little bit more with implementation in mind. So how do we actually do experiments that have, from the beginning, real implementation in mind? And then, and of course, Tessa is sitting there, Tessa with Justin Sanderford and Germano, he's sitting there as well, have this interesting paper, of course, that something that had efficacy in Western Kenya when Michael Kramer and team were doing it, it actually, for some reason or another, they didn't seem to be able to manage to do it, and the interpretation has been, you know, look, once you did it in the government schools, the unions probably or whatever were actually blocking it, and so you get these constraints. Now, it suggests somehow, well, you can't just take it from one to the other. You'll need to probably do something else there in that particular context. And then John List has recently got this paper in Nature, you know, very eloquently written as John does, but actually making a relatively simple point, which is they say, don't do this kind of efficacy testing just like that. Don't do what he then calls A/B, but he meant really efficacy testing, but actually begin to start from the constraints for scaling, and actually then design what you want to do. Around it can actually design to do it. So John would say you have to turn the process around. And so doing it, we'll have to see, and there will be, I'm sure, examples coming there. But what it for me illustrates is actually more the following, is that, and I think, you know, Pascaline was talking about it on health, that a lot of the things we've done is a form of second best. The big picture thing, where it actually is about merit goods or public goods provided by governments or through coordination by different authorities, we have endless workarounds it. So we do second best work, and we do it. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong, but have we done this in the true second best sense? Where you say, okay, can we actually move towards the best possible workaround? Or indeed, and I'll come back to that in a moment, are we thinking enough about these constraints to start with? And so maybe once you have implementation in mind, it actually say, well, you know, I would love that the whole Kenyan education system had teaching assistants, but we know there is a massive constraint all the way up to the Supreme Court that the teacher union will never allow it. Okay, well, what should I have actually started with researching? I should have known that this would not be scalable. Maybe I should have thought about something else. I'm not saying doing, but it's just, are we doing it? And I think the more I listen to actually many of the papers with that in mind, I think we do a lot of that. Maybe is it a matter of acknowledging that, or, and I will come back to that, or are we happy enough with the second best? And are we actually happy enough with that? I think it gets worse once we take the politics into account. And the political economy, we don't take well into account, and it's a hard thing to often do, and we like to think that we may not have to do it. So maybe I'm having worked too much in a political institution for the last 10 years. I see politics all around me, and maybe that's wrong. But, you know, if we take seriously even, you know, just Dercon and Jim's, you know, why nations fail, but the view on, you know, there's places with really extractive institutions. Now, in a place with extractive institutions, I doubt that does empower the government will really be keen on inclusive development. I mean, that almost per definition would follow. So you actually have a lot of places, in fact, their list is very, very long, where actually maybe the objective function of the governments is actually more complicated. I'm not saying that they don't like the idea that the economy would grow or indeed inclusive development takes place, but it's definitely much more constrained. So if, and of course, I can't help a brief plug, but that's like what I also definitely would say, I've learned working in a lot of places, that actually, if we don't take that into account, as the aid business as well, we're not getting anywhere. You know, if it takes two to tango, it needs someone that has an objective that is more or less aligned for you to actually do things, or you go for other second-best solutions like payment by results and so on, which is in such a limited situation that it actually really can work. So you go for all kinds of second-best type of thing. And in any case, I think we assume, and I think we sometimes do too much, we assume that those we are dealing with really want this. They really want the change that we actually advocating. And the way I would think about it is there's multiple ways in which they may filter. We are supplying evidence and the way we supply it, and then, you know, how they filter it. And definitely there's ideological filters, you know, DFID was actually, even before the evidence base grew to the state it was now, for a long time a big advocate of cash transfers. You know, we go back even by the time I joined, it was actually already said, look, where the evidence begins to go, this is probably a bet we should be taking. And it proved right, so we were doing cash transfers left, right, and center, and wanted to do more of it. Very interestingly, it became the basis of attacking DFID. And in fact, when DFID was abolished Boris Johnson said in Parliament, no more cash transfers, no more cash points in the sky, as he called it. And he was referring to the Benazir Bhutto program that we had actually quite successfully helped in Pakistan for the first time, a large-scale program to get going, and that was the one that he based himself to abolish the place. So evidence was used as, no evidence was used to abolish something that was actually pretty evidence-based. And that's it. So you have the ideological filter. So what the hell do you do with Boris, okay? And okay, I can't help telling another story. During COVID, in September 2020, I was back working in government. The data scientist came to complain to me of number 10, came to say, can you believe what happened? We have this beautiful dashboard of data on COVID. And every week, in principle, we give it to him and he makes decisions, or sometimes every few days if it seems to be changing. And we started the meeting and he said, you know what, today I only want good news. So please don't tell me any of the data that are bad news, okay? The UK didn't lock down then, and the rest is history. And basically, it's not even come out in the inquiry, but it will, maybe, in this way. But there's other people as well that you work with, and that actually, you worry about, do they really want to implement something? They like you to do your experiment, but will they actually, in due course, they love the idea that a UNDP puts in a lot of money and they get flashy cars to drive around. So maybe it's rent-seeking. And look, I definitely have experienced it. I would be surprised if some of you haven't. And indeed, there's some cases documented also on India where there is a bit of a sense where that may be linked why things could not be scaled or implemented. Now, it's a very interesting thing. You could then say, it's the paper in the DRC with Jean Trevicle and Bergeron and so on that says, look, even in these places we managed to do something to do with taxes. And I always, okay, I can be wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected in due course. But it's very interesting is the one RCTs we get really big effects early on in the DRCs where you end up giving more money to the local authority. And then you can get more taxes. Now, it's important and we should be doing it, but it's again some of the few we can do. I definitely know some of the other side. There was a reasonably effective, reasonably tested with many RCTs in Western Kenya, early days. And this is not to do with very well published, but it's Ben Piper and others with RTI were doing a program with USAID to SOMA, it was called. Quite an integrated different things. They tested nice things. There was a bit of a systems reform. Education improvements seemed to be there, and the counterfactuals were really relatively well defined. It was definitely something you said, okay, at scale in Kenya, we didn't have that much then. It seems to be a good entry point to do more of it. We come by 2012. Uhuru Kenyatta is standing for election to be president. People try to present him with the evidence, say, oh, no, I really want to fight on education, but, I don't like these programs. I'm going to do on one laptop a child. And he basically makes his big election commitment on he's going to roll out one laptop to child, one of the interventions in education that we know, as far as I know, doesn't work, but it's very attractive because endless procurement contracts and the whole kind of thing. And so basically, with the new government, $340 million later, it's now been closed and there's no effects of that program. So if we're dealing in that kind of world, I had fascinating conversations also with John Piper and others and say, well, how should we have acted at the time? Should we have found a way of accommodating something and actually feel whether we could actually move forward? But it was pure rent-seeking that was going on in this program. And of course, political opportunism, it's actually, and I write this with small letters because I'm almost sympathetic to it. Once we got beginning to get, well, this is 2013, getting pushback on cash transfers, and this before Boris managed to abolish DFID, there was pushback in the newspapers on cash transfers, even though the evidence showed it. And I remember sitting in a meeting with the minister, and the minister, making the case, look, we don't know about these programs, whether we should do it. Yes, we've reached a target already in terms of impact on cash transfers, but why don't we do more of this and move some money of programs, maternal health programs? We couldn't quite see in any of the data that we have an impact. Can we move the money there? And she was sympathetic. Justin Greening was the minister. She was actually quite interested. Okay, that sounds good. A political advisor interrupts us and say, there's no way we're going to do this. And we know we're going to do this because This is the middle of UK austerity under George Osborne. Basically cut back on transfers for poor people in the north of England. How can we ever justify cutting transfers to people in the north of England while we're giving more cash transfers with our aid money? And that was the basis of, and it was abolished. Political opportunism, there's no way we're going to take the reputational risk. Evidence was not going to be used here, and we did maternal health programs that we still have no clue about whether they actually had any impact. Anyway, that's opportunism, and it plays into politics. Now, the problem is, and I felt that definitely always sitting there on the other side, should I just take their objectives as given? Okay? Now, in the UK, it's not too bad. You know, I'm at least, as long as you ignore Boris Johnson, but it's not too bad. In the time that I was a DFID chief economist, I think for most of the time that Rachel Glenister was there, ministers were relatively reasonable, so their objectives were okay. I feel sorry for someone who has to do that in Nigeria, or maybe in Kenya, or in Mali, where actually maybe the pressures are very different. So should we encourage them, or should we do research to serve the objectives of those in power and be mercenaries to actually very poor objectives? I don't think so, but it's a choice to be made. But then, of course, maybe we'll have to be more creative, and I think that's in a way what we do. What we do, I think, is do a form of second-best research. We keep our objective function, and we treat it as a principal-agent problem where we're the principal, the agent is the policymaker, and say, okay, how can we work through this thing here that actually we can still get as good for development as we can? I would say that's probably what we do, and actually I think that's fine. But it's still tricky, because, but having said that, maybe it does mean sometimes when we do a new experiment in certain places, to actually think through, definitely Nigeria springs to mind, maybe to be impactful, we should begin to think about it, what can be woven through the system here, given all these rent-seeking incentives that exist, and do this. So it's a form of second-best research. Okay. So I want to put this briefly together and challenge you, because we have the tendency, I have the tendency, if I look back on most of the research I've done, is to actually say, well, we assume that those people we want to influence, they want development, and we assume that we go for the best possible program, the most efficacy. It's a form of first best. By the way, and Andrew can later on challenge me on it, but if you go around the world saying best practice, Burkina Faso should do what Indonesia does, you're a bit in that world. Definitely the IMF does it, definitely. This is the blueprint, they should be doing it and not really thinking through it. So what I'm now beginning to suggest is saying, well, maybe either we do it, or maybe we should be doing it more explicitly if we want to have more impact, thinking through what are the objectives and how it fits with vested interest. You know, if you want to do trade policy, better understand the vested interest and look for the best way of doing it. If we want to do impact in health and education, think through some of these things. And you know, second best, taking the implementation constraints into account, or the political constraints. It's very unsatisfactory, okay? Very unsatisfactory. So, and in a way, this is, I think, Pascaline, what you had, it's what we seem to have done in many places. Huh? In many places, we've gone for, you know, it should be much more global public goods, it should be much more merit good provided by government, and we end up doing workarounds. Can we actually get the thing doing? Maybe it's fine, but the problem is scale effects are maybe not there, and are we doing enough? Now, I'm not saying it's wrong, but what I like to think about, and what I think is a little bit of an interesting thing, is actually doing a bit like a framework that Dercon and Jim had in a Journal of Economic Perspectives paper in 2012, where they basically set up a model in their kind of model of institutions, but basically say, if you do an intervention, treat the political constraints as endogenous. And actually begin to think about, how can I, for example, strengthen the sensible people in the Ministry of Health and maybe design my RCTs so that actually these people are being strengthened because we want them to be strong so that they do more sensible things and maybe more moving towards these kind of things. So you begin to be thinking through and make the constraints endogenous. So you do second best with endogenous constraints. Implementation constraints, which will be, of course, a similar thing. You think through, okay, maybe the civil service can't deliver it now because the incentives are not aligned. How do I design my program that I begin to overcome this as well? And so maybe they could do. I like to think then we have achieved what I would like to be, is a subversive researcher, trying to change the status quo in many of these places and do some subversion, you know, with our suits on or with our T-shirts on, sitting in our ivory towers. So actually thinking through that. So the thing. Anyway, I leave that here as a thought. I want to just briefly and finally, briefly actually mention a couple of other tricks that I thought, but I would love, in due course, also hear more on other tricks that people have used to actually be influential. So my situation is essentially the advisor, the civil servant, working with a senior decision maker. You know, you're the advisor in the system, or you have access to the advisors. You know, their beliefs may be wrong. They may be the people that are actually quite ignorant. You know, Abhijit was yesterday talking about it. You know, we need to make sure they understand what the poverty is and so on. But they have strong views about what it is actually, and they have strong views. They think that every cash transfer is going to be boosted away, or they're going to buy cigarettes, or they're going to do something with it. Or similarly, that short-term political cycle thing. So I'm going to go fast, but I want to say is that one experience I have, and I think you can just see this, Harry Truman, the famous thing is that, and a lot of the presentations were this, on the one hand, on the other hand. And as academics, there's a lot of on the one hand and on the other hand stuff going on. And Truman famously shouted, "Give me a one-handed economist." And I do think if we want to be impactful in policy, we probably should be one-handed. Because in my experience, think of what I said on Boris Johnson, don't just present them with the evidence. Be very clear what your judgment is what the evidence tells us. Don't just assume that they can read it and understand it. And in fact, there's interesting work. Maybe we can increase their understanding. There's some nice papers emerging on training policymakers in econometrics, which is like, I think it's very cruel actually getting them to do econometrics. The Angrist book, you know, first 10 chapters on incoming civil servants that had never had statistics training, and they basically are trained in that stuff. But the team there, and Shaheen Nasir with us in Oxford, they seem to be finding impacts that they actually are better at making decisions. So you can maybe train them a bit, and that's an interesting thing. My sense is a little bit that if we want to be one-handed, it means we have to be willing to take judgments. You know, it means that Eric has to say what he thinks about the industrial policy at some point. He has to be willing to say that my best understanding is this. Because if you leave it then to someone else, they will pick and choose what you can do. And so it's be like a judge. But you do it properly, that you document it, but you make it clear what it is. And I think actually the researcher that wants to be policy influential has to be willing to be like a judge. Provide a judgment over the overall state of the evidence, and that's of course why I like all these VoxDev lists and so on, because they are beginning to give maybe advisors inside systems the ability to be have a clearer judgment on it. So finally, where then some of the tricks can come into it, I want to briefly, for a second, refer to very quickly on overcoming ignorance, something about getting the stories right, and then about know your time, and then very quickly. So one thing, of course, that behavioral economics, and we have many ways of bringing this all together, and there's different schools of thought how to do it, but I like the idea to think that most people have a form of a mental model, basically a model of how the world works, the causal relationships, and so on. Of course, there's lots of heuristics and shortcuts in there, but it's all within some kind of understanding of the world. Yeah. The point is a little bit that policymakers have this as well, and we love also confirmation bias. They like to hear what they believe. This is Boris Johnson at his worst. Tell me just so that my beliefs are being confirmed, that everything is getting better. And so basically, you want to overcome that. And for me, one of the main lessons that I learned, if I had to advise someone, I better understood how they thought. So you spend a lot of time talking to them and hearing what they're doing. There was one minister that actually took tutorials first in development economics before a single piece of advice on anything to do for these things came. She was very good in doing that, but basically invest in shaping and correcting how they think. That's a constructive way. But understand how they think. Don't assume that they are like us. We have the tendency to assume that they get it when we say this is the evidence. No, you have to take them on a journey. How do they think about it? and so on. So the other thing is, of course, we know that framing matters a lot. And one thing that I've been doing quite a lot is whenever I've been asked to do some form of training of civil servants, I always started with a repeat of the little Kahneman and Tversky loss aversion, risk aversion thing. Because it's the simplest way to actually suddenly making them understand, oh my God, how things are framed matters. And so we do a version where it's simply about an epidemic will kill 120,000 people, the same expected values, just changing the word saving and dying. So saving lives or dying. And you can do it in a group of 20 people, and you'll still get the effects more or less that you want to, what the original experiment gives us. It has so much external validity. But the moment that you tell them, I remember in the National Statistical Office in the UK, they changed their procedures on how they looked at their questions in their questionnaires, because they suddenly realized one question and they themselves were being tricked to actually simply the word saving and dying interchangeably, and they could see it in the room. They understand statistics and they were shocked. So there's now a process of red teaming that whenever they do a questionnaire, they actually have a team that needs to be checking slight reformulations, do we get in pilots different answers, which is correct. And so but anyway, so you can do things like that. Of course, the stories we are told matter. You know, lots of people here are old enough to recognize this man. You know, very influential. You didn't have to say that it was an advertisement for Marlboro. Everybody knew after a bit it was that. The way the story is told matters. Of course, in research, we have some striking examples. In the same sampling design, the same analysis design, you have David showing that radio messages, propaganda through the radio, have very negative effects, and a more recent paper by Sharoun and Arthur Blouin that actually finds that positive propaganda changed the ethnic saliency in countries, you know? And it's a nice one because it's exactly the same design in the way they deal with it. So it tells us, you know, the story matters, and a great deal. And so basically, we need to think about presentation of stories, what Chris said early on, because it can be abused, and that's the main thing. The stories can be abused. Usually, I had to learn to see, you know, politicians like positive upside. So I have to make sure that I'm in an honest way, tell them what they actually can do, and not simply saying all the problems in the world. And so I had to find a way of doing this, and comes back to the one-handed economist. And then the final thing is a quick example on bandwidth that I've seen in terms of evidence. I don't know if I say blue oceans, plastic in the ocean, where the people remember, it's about 6-7 years ago, a documentary by David Attenborough, the BBC documentary, that actually showed there were plastics in the ocean, these little bowls. So it was definitely something, in a lot of countries it was shown immediately, and it had quite a lot of effect. In fact, the newspapers were reporting on a TV program. You know, in an age where people are not even watching TV anymore, but watching it on their iPads or whatever, it was actually front page news. Now, what I want to mention on this is that you see it also in the data. Google searches on plastics in the ocean suddenly were trending at the top. Overnight in 2017 to the top. What is interesting, 6 months before that, the government chief scientist in the UK and his Office of Science had done a report. And it had said everything that needed to be said in there. And they had done exactly what the Government Office of Science does, which is whenever they finished a report, they put it in the box of the Prime Minister and then expecting her to read it over the weekend. So the thing, because this is an important thing, long-term, important thing, not urgent, but important thing. You know, we need to have long-term planning around it. And it comes back, as usually documents come back from a minister with a little pencil tick on it. Yes, I've read it. No comments and so on. The whole report was read and the whole summary document was supposedly read. Of course, nothing happened in these 6 months before. The day after the TV program, the same civil servant puts the report back in her box. The next day, I remember on the receiving end, every government department was instructed to look for ways to reduce plastics in the ocean. And it's an important thing because we have bandwidth problems, poor people have bandwidth problems, politicians have bandwidth problems. They have a lot of stuff to do. So wait for your moment, and windows of opportunity matter. And it's really crucial, pick your time when you do it. So thinking, I've written the paper, surely they should act, sit on it, wait for it. There will be a moment, and look for your moment when you do it. I'm going to stop now. So I'm going to get, yeah. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, yeah, I did not think so. Okay, sorry. That means this one is off. Okay. Is it?
It took a moment.
All right, okay, great. So thank you very much, Stefan, for that very interesting introduction. I'm here from the policy side, so I'm going to take you through not just my experience as a policy maker, but through Operation Vulindlela on the implementation side. So I've called it, might sound somewhat dramatic, but this is called Tales from the Coalface, because once you've got the research, once you've sold the research, even if you've thought about implementation at the start, it still doesn't always go the way that you think you're going to go, especially in the South African context. So just to briefly recap, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with South Africa's growth or lack thereof, you can see quite a sharp disjuncture, quite a sharp decoupling for South Africa versus almost any other, certainly versus the global trend, and also whatever other country you would want to compare South Africa to. So you see the same kind of thing whether you're looking at South Africa versus other upper middle income countries, whether you're looking at South Africa versus other commodity exporting countries. And certainly what we are trying to do internally as technocrats is indicate that this is therefore a policy choice or a lack of good policy making. This isn't something that the world is doing to us. And that, as you can imagine, doesn't always go down well internally at all. So in 2019, given this sharp decoupling, and by 2019, South Africa had, after a period of fairly strong growth in the early 2000s, South Africa had now been experiencing almost a decade of stagnation. And the problems were really well known. They'd been well researched. We had a plethora of information on the fact that our network industries were old, inefficient, expensive. We knew that there were barriers to entry in many of these sectors of the economy that were characterized by monopolies and dominated by old firms, and that meant that there was no entry dynamism. We have a significant problem with unemployment and growth in sectors that would otherwise be labor absorbing, like agriculture and services, had been kind of crowded out, due to considerations around industrial policy and this idea that we should follow the same development trajectory that had been seen in the past. So what the National Treasury did was put together a policy document. It actually didn't start as a policy document. It was really our manifesto on growth. It ended up being a 70-page document with almost 150 references. Now, that may not be the same page-to-reference ratio that you would see in a normal academic paper, but in the policy space, it was very, very different. Normally, policy documents tend to be expressions of opinion rather than really rooted in fact. And so this caused quite a lot, this caused waves. And on the back of that, we managed to get almost all of the recommendations from that paper into the policy document called the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan that was released after COVID. So we'd done some modeling, which I think really helped to sell the message in the paper, and had shown that if you were to implement all of the reforms in the paper, you could actually get this accelerated growth. And so it caused a lot of excitement in political circles, and we were able to then get this adopted and then put into policy. Now, what was sad about this was that a lot of these things had already been on the table. A lot of these things were already enshrined in various policies. And so the question is, how do you see this stagnation for such a long period of time when you have the research, you've had people talking about implementation, you know what the answers are, you know that there's upside, and then still you have nothing. So there had been, various experiments in South Africa's past around public sector performance management and implementation, and what we found was that things were just really not going anywhere. So when Operation Vulindlela was created, we were tasked with actually implementing the goals and priorities of the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. What Operation Vulindlela, or OV, is a delivery unit. So it's a partnership between the Presidency of South Africa and the National Treasury. So I have my colleague from the Presidency, Saul Muske, here, and I'm sure he'll weigh in at some point. And basically we were told, look, it's your job to implement these things. You now have to get this stuff over the line. And so we set up, we selected the top priorities from both of these papers, and we've set out to kind of implement that. And we've had lots of success. I mean, we release quarterly reports, and we've been able to hit a lot of the targets. A lot of the work that we actually did was in pushing through regulatory reform. And I'll get to a case study at the end. But a lot of it was just making sure that the policy decisions that had already been taken actually find expression. So we had a situation, for example, on the logistics side, where in 2004, when the Ports Act was passed, the understanding was that the national ports would be spun out of Transnet, which is the monopoly, and corporatized, and that still hadn't happened. And so we've been tasked with doing a lot of that kind of implementation work. We think we've been somewhat successful. We have, this is just a subset of the reforms that we've been able to complete and then model. Over the medium term, we think that it will add up to at least 500 billion, and this is in a 3 trillion rand a year economy. So over the medium term, just these 3 areas of reform, and we have 36, could actually add up to quite significant economic gains. So I'll just quickly take you through, in the time that I have left, a case study that of how this thing actually works. So many of you would know that South Africa is actually, I'll skip to the end. So South Africa is actually caught in an electricity crisis. We simply cannot produce enough electricity, and so you have regular load shedding. Some of you may already have experienced that. And actually, this started in 2007. And because of these kind of ideological blockages, whether it's vested interest or maybe some unholy combination of the two, we've spent almost all of that time trying to fix Eskom, which is the national electricity monopoly, when already in 2007, there was enough evidence to show that these kind of vertically integrated monopolies were not the best, most efficient way of delivering electricity. Other countries had already started to move away from that. But we kind of stuck to that, and successively, there was always a new turnaround plan, a new board, a new injection of money from the fiscus. And finally, we got to a point where the economy has really almost collapsed under the strain. If you try and estimate the impact that this has had, up to 40% of South Africa's historical underperformance could be explained by this lack of energy. And so that's really quite significant. We're able to use that as impetus for reform. So one of the easiest, earliest things that could have happened to alleviate the electricity constraint was simply to allow the private sector to build their own facilities. But legally, that was not possible. You couldn't actually just have your own generation facility, much less generate and sell to other people. And there was such huge ideological opposition to allowing this to happen, despite the fact that you're stuck in an energy crisis, and there's having a massive impact on growth, and you're having hours and hours of outages. What we had to do then was actually go back to the basics and build an almost incontrovertible evidence base to take to decision makers and say, look, this is a simple, costless, something that can happen overnight and that can help to alleviate the constraint. So we had to commission some modeling that indicated what the actual potential impact of this could be, engage quite significantly with all of the stakeholders, and that's quite an iterative process. I mean, I noted, Stefan, in you almost characterized it as you're engaging with a decision maker, but the reality is once you get to the implementation side, you are engaging with a range of decision makers at various levels, at various times, who have their own interests, not necessarily intersecting. So it's not like when you deal with government, you are dealing with one person and one decision maker. It changes all of the time. And that can actually make the process of implementation much more complicated than you would imagine at the beginning. And so we'd had to deal with this and kind of engage. What we ended up doing, given the nature of the crisis, and we're kind of assisted here, is going directly to the president, who was then able to announce in his speech in 2021 that the lifting of this licensing threshold went from 0 to 100 megawatts, and then finally was eliminated in the year thereafter. So I'll leave it here and just take questions in the Q&A.
Thank you. No. All right, I'm going to spare you the torture of giving you slides. And as I was actually thinking about this session, I was a bit intimidated, and I didn't know what exactly to tell a group of really well-established deep researchers on development. Okay, so I was told that I shouldn't be talking about how we use evidence to inform policy successfully. So what else can I tell you? So what I decided to tell you is to maybe remind you about the blind sides you might have, okay? And I'm going to assume a completely different view from Stefan Dercon. I'm going to assume that because you work in development, you do care that your research be used. Otherwise, you should be doing physics or math, right? It's not that physics and math don't add to our knowledge, but understanding celestial bodies and how they move, deep space, it's wonderful stuff, but it's just something that is satisfying for human knowledge, but it's not something you use in your daily life, right? So if you're working in development, I'm going to assume, like we do in economics, that you actually do care that your research be used. OK, so if that is the case, here is a factual thing. Extreme poverty in Africa is actually rising. Right? Just think about that. And global poverty in the next decade or so, if nothing happens in Africa, might be rising. Why? Because all the other regions have reduced extreme poverty substantially. And so you can't rely on them to drive the reduction in extreme poverty. So unless extreme poverty in Africa declines, global poverty is probably going to go up. But in the last 20 years, in the last couple of days, we've learned how much knowledge we've kind of generated to help us there, okay? And so one of the blind sides is that all that knowledge is running way ahead of policy uptake. And whose responsibility should that be to make sure that at least that, in fact, you pair the opportunity with the knowledge? If it's not you, is it the World Bank? We'll do our part. I mean, if you look at the parts and the reports from the World Bank, a lot of you will be quoted to be, just to be frank, right? Some of that, of course, is strategic behavior and people pushing their own, projects. But some of them are your students. They genuinely believe this stuff, right? But there is very little uptake. At least in the way we think, at the scale at which it should be, right? So I would urge you to think about how to get engaged, right? Because just because you have brilliant ideas doesn't mean that it will be taken up, okay? If you're not engaging and if you're not trying to convince people, okay, you have no voice. We talk a lot about the importance of voice for the poor and all that stuff. Well, you would not have voice. If you're not in the room making a case for your research, it will not be taken up, because when policy decisions are being taken, it's not always on merit on the basis of data. So there's some urgency for us to think about a collective action issue here about making sure that research gets into policy. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I'm going to make is that if you take my position that research, policy uptake is important, and so you're going to get engaged in it, we should understand how policy is made. Okay, there is a vision we have about policy. Okay, we think that or the way we think it should be done, right? You think about a policy, you figure out what evidence you have, you maybe even do some meta-analysis, you do cost-benefit analysis, and you say, okay, that's what I'm going to go with. That's not how policy is made. The politicians just announce a policy. They just announce something. And then they will work out the details. Budgets, they will find money if they actually have a favorite policy. So let me give you a couple of examples. A friend of mine was, I'll go far and then come down quickly. A friend of mine was in Central Asia a couple of weeks ago and was going to talk with his team, was going to talk to the government there about their anti-poverty programs, right? So at the same time that they were there was a high-level Chinese delegation that was visiting the country, and the president met with the Chinese delegation for 30 minutes. And a few days later, the World Bank team was called in, and they say, I'm going to reduce poverty the way the Chinese did it. That's how the policy was announced. We have no idea what that means, right? But that's the policy. So you have to kind of figure it out. I'll give you an example, much closer. The Kenyan administration, the current one, when they were coming in, basically announced something called a Hustler Fund. Actually, this is something important. So if you are skin researchers, you should get interested in this one. It's called a Hustler Fund because the principal, I'm not talking about the principal agent issue here, I'm talking about the principal who is the person who is making this policy, has a narrative about the Kenyan poor. That there are a bunch of hustlers who really are constrained, and if only we could give them some support, they will actually transform the country, right? What did Abhijit call it yesterday? Upward spirals, right? Like, they will just go on upward spirals. And so he announced this. Who is this going to benefit? Well, we'll figure that out. How much is it? We'll start with 50 billion shillings and maybe increase it. Is it going to be consumption smoothing for the poor? Maybe. Is it some credit constraint for small business owners? Maybe. It's a number of things. But the important thing is that it was announced, it's being implemented, okay? And so what do you do? If you get involved in policy, what do you do in that case? Okay, you could try the 3 options that Stefan proposed. I'll add a 4th one. Even if you're completely agnostic about that policy, but you think that there is some chance that it will actually improve the lives of the poor, you might want to help this country learn. Just learn how to implement projects, because that's what development, after all, is about. You have to learn how to do things. And we need to help the governments learn how to do these things. So you could help them collect data. There was, in the first few weeks, 18 million loans were borrowed. 18 million. This is a country of 55 million, right? So it's not trivial stuff. It's big stuff, right? So you could help them learn, right? Collect data. Who is borrowing this? How often? Where are they? What's their profile, right? And so on and so on and so on, right? So this is important stuff. So you can't just, as researchers, I think we should get involved in those kinds of things. Okay, final point, missing questions. Every time I go to meetings with African policymakers, the things they talk to me about are very different from the things we've been talking about, especially now. Debt management. I know these are macro things, and I know that the empirical macro has sort of been crowded out by empirical micro, so unfortunately, you're going to have to start bringing them back in somehow. But debt management, fiscal crisis, one possibility. There was a minister of finance from a West African country who, every time we went to meet with him, the bank people will go and talk to him about this wonderful education project, wonderful health project, and all that stuff that we're doing, and what big impacts they're having. And he will wait, and he will wait, and he will say, do you guys at the World Bank have any ideas about how a country like mine should finance long-term development without aid? That's his question. Every time. And we don't have answers for it. Right? So missing questions. One of the missing questions, value chain development. So again, a country in West Africa comes to us and says, you know what? I want to develop rice value chain development. Why? There are 400 million people in West Africa. Okay? And growing. Potentially will double. It's a lot of people. A lot of them use rice as a staple. A lot of that rice is imported. So there are huge issues here about balance of payment potentially a lot of other problems that they have. And a country comes and says, we want to develop value chains. And I'm not talking about just improving production of rice. No, he's talking about value chains in rice. Production, all this stuff in the middle about milling, packaging, processing, and then consumers in the final end, and creating markets in the final end. We have no answers for them. We could take them to Vietnam or Thailand or something like that, but There's no research we can point to that says, oh yeah, somebody has actually looked at all this stuff and this is the way in which you create this market, in which you solve this market, and so on and so on, right? So missing questions. Things, some of the big things is, again and again and again, that these countries talk about is, how do I change the structure of production in agriculture, in non-agriculture, so that these economies can grow and create more jobs that are meaningful? Because they're really worried about these dissatisfied young people who potentially could be explosive, right? It's very existential stuff, right? Some of these are micro stuff, so you could potentially work at them. Some of them, of course, are macro. But these are the kinds of things that are missing in our research agenda, and I hope that some of you will take it up. I know that academic incentives as they are, you may not want to take these questions that are kind of vague, don't have a lot of data, but are first order important for these countries. So I'm appealing to the editors of journals, because there are a lot of you are very powerful and are gatekeepers of these publications, that you should let your students work on these things. So that's an appeal, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and share some of my thoughts on this issue with you. The one thing I thought about as I listened to Stefan and the other panelists, if you put 10 Africans in a room, 5 researchers and 5 policymakers, and ask them, why wasn't there enough research evidence used in policy making? I bet you the 5 policymakers will give you the same answer. They will say the research that is available is lagging in rigor and relevance. That's what they will say. And I'll tell you, the 5 researchers will say these policymakers don't believe in research evidence. And I've listened to this for more than 30 years of my life. I began, as most of you know, as a young researcher in Ghana, doing work on informal finance when it was not an attractive thing for economists to do. We did all of that, moved on to do formal finance and studying banking in West Africa and banking in East Africa. We did all of that, which we thought was attractive enough for governments in the region. Indeed, we were invited to meetings to meet finance ministers and heads of central banks and so on. We did all of that, believing that our work would begin to influence the way banking reforms were being conceived in the 80s and 90s. Not much of it happened. At each time, the explanation was given that, well, we need to have a longer time frame to think about these things, but there are more urgent matters like privatizing commercial banks and so on to deal with. So over the years, I've listened to these explanations given. Today, I'm in the position of associating with 2 of the largest entities in the region for producing research. I run the research network of universities, and then I'm also chair of the AERC board. One of the things that come up all the time is these same things every time. Why don't you guys do the type of research that will answer the challenges of the region? And I'm spent more time persuading governments in the region to give me money so we can do it. No. We can get it from elsewhere for cheaper. So while you are struggling to convince your government or governments in the region to put more money into research, they are always pushing back with the arguments of lack of rigor and lack of relevance. How do you deal with that? AERC has been around for 35 years. And in those 35 years, we've built the capacity of almost every young African economist that I know, whether they're in central banks or economic departments. We've done all of that. They do research, They do research. Every year we're giving over 100 grants for people to do research. So in 33 years, you can imagine, we've done quite a bit of that. The interesting thing is, when I talk to funders trying to get more money for AERC, everybody talks about, well, the work doesn't have much in terms of policy relevance. Really. We've been doing work on poverty. We've been doing, most of the work in this region that led to the PRSPs and so on was initiated by AERC researchers. And yet, we still talk about lack of relevance, lack of rigor. So today, we struggle to show everybody that work from AERC could be relevant and also quite rigorously done. We organize senior policy seminars where we bring ministers from various countries to come and look at the work being done in trade or work being done in debt management so they can go and see how best they can use it. Nothing happens. So the other side, you have the PEP. I don't know if many of you are familiar with PEP, the Partnership for Economic Policy. PEP, by design, works with policymakers to avoid the situation of being told that the work was lacking in relevance and rigor. So PEP, for every single project, it requires that a policymaker be part of the team. And the design takes into account the policy relevance of whatever was being done, whether it's in the area of social protection, education, health, microfinance. Everything has to be. And when you go to the PEP website, it tells you that 54% of all the work that is done has found its way to the desk of policymakers. Of course, there are challenges with attribution. How much of what governments do can you attribute to the research being done or that they've seen? So, seeing all these challenges between policymakers and researchers, the kind of tensions that have surfaced over the years, I've come to a few explanations, some of which are very much in line with what Stefan was telling us. Why this dichotomy between how policymakers see it and how researchers see it? The first explanation for the greater use of evidence in more advanced economies, in my view, can come from the resource availability point. Far more resources go into research in the North, and therefore there's far more research being done. So your average policymaker has access to a vast array of pieces of information that he or she can use. So the average policymaker reads things that will find their way into newspapers or into television or some other form of communication. And so the average policymaker uses, whether intentionally or not, work that is available or has come out of work that has been elsewhere. So that's the first point. If you look at Africa, you really have to go looking for evidence that investing in the education of the girl child will have some significant impact on maternal mortality. It takes a lot of work to be able to do that and look for it. The second point is the political context. There's general distrust between political elements and researchers. And I can give you a number of personal experience and stories, trying to argue with a politician about whether a free SHS in Ghana is worth it or not, and their responses. When I have a beer, I will tell you what my own position on this one is. So there's this trust. The politician has a fair view of exactly what he or she wants to achieve within a particular time frame, usually 4 years. And the researcher has a different perspective on what is important, what is desired in order to bring about change in the economy, whether it's the generation of employment and so on. So that political context is important. And I like the example that Stefan gave in relation to the famous Boris Johnson. Cultural factors. The distrust extends to policymakers who have no major expectations of researchers. Many of the policymakers who will say that the research being done by the African researchers is lacking in rigor and lacking the relevance being absent, are people who studied with these researchers. They studied in the same lecture rooms and listened to the same lectures. And with time, as the divisions occur, they are able to see how different things have been. And so nobody is going to show much interest in the policy, in the research that you are doing, so long as that distrust remains. The fourth point I make is capacity and expertise. This is related to the resource availability argument. There are fewer researchers in Africa and fewer people who are capable of interpreting the research. I do remember in ARC we discussed whether there was a need for us to insert in various finance ministries and other ministries people who could interpret findings from research projects for the policymaker. Was it important? I didn't think so. Today, in almost every ministry, whether it's trade, whether it's agriculture, health, education, for most countries, there's a research department. And that research department is equipped with people with PhDs in economics, PhD in health, education, so many things. So they do understand the research. There's a lack of, if they are not using the research, it's not for lack of understanding or the absence of the information. It's simply the result of a very different set of objectives in mind. They are thinking about 4 years. They are thinking about the next election. They are thinking about the things that are going to make them look good. They are not thinking about structural transformation. If structural transformation, how do you do it in 4 years? Nobody here has an answer to that, and that's where the difference is. The fifth one is about the collaboration networking. The more collaboration there is, the higher the likelihood of adoption. That's why in the PEP projects, they do always preach the need to embed researchers in the team, embed policymakers in the research team. Has it worked? It works in the sense that the policymakers know about the research. Can they adopt it? Are they powerful enough in their institutions to adopt it? That's another thing that needs to be discussed. International influence. African governments are more likely to be interested in available research from outside. When Stefan walks into the Ministry of Finance in Accra or in agriculture or wherever, he's coming with millions of pounds behind him. So the Ghana government has a lot of interest in listening to Stefan, not to me. That's the reality. If I'm lucky enough for Stefan to say, Ernest, come along, then I may have a new voice. If Stefan doesn't call me, I have no voice. So that international disparity is a reality for most African countries. I've seen many of my friends from Europe and North America come together. We have dinner, and then they have a meeting with the finance minister, and I know how the discussion is going to go. It always leads to the minister recommending that some research be adopted as part of the government program. It works. So, in the good old days, if I wanted to influence the Ghana government on how privatization of banks should be done, I told my friends at the World Bank, and that if I was able to convince them, and they came to Ghana, they would sell the idea to the Ghana government, and the Ghana government would buy it, not knowing it came from me. Times have changed. Today, I have no friends at the World Bank, so I don't have much influence. Final point, policy context. Policy makers in Africa usually work with a shorter-term perspective, which is linked to some of the points I've made. If you want your government to listen to you in Africa, think not beyond 4 years. Even if it's something beyond 4 years, break it into 4-year bits. They are much more likely to believe it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have a bit of time still for Q&A or comments, basically. It doesn't have to be questions to the panel. I thought, though, it may be, since nobody's actually, there's some hands going up. I was actually going for a moment to ask Sol from the presidency, working as an advisor in the presidency here. You were telling me some examples of, successful use of more of this microevidence and not so successful uses. So if you could briefly, if you could get him the microphone, it actually is quite interesting to see how also some of these experiences here at the back, yeah.
Thanks, Stefan, and thanks for a really provocative, engaging discussion to everyone. I mean, I think over the last 2 days, it's been striking just how much work there is and how much we already know, as others have said, about what works and what should be done. And a little bit depressing how little of that reflects in policy already. But I think a lot of it comes down to the practical constraints of policy making and implementation. And we have this sort of ideal model where you test an intervention, you get the data, you prove that it works, and then you implement it. You persuade the policymaker, and you find the resources, and it gets done. And in practice, that is never the case. I think Andrew hit the nail on the head with, you announce the policy and then work out the details. We're very guilty of that. And yet, I think there are a number of examples where there has been real success in the engagement between researchers and policymakers, at least in the South African context, which shows a slightly different way of how it can work. And 3 come to mind. I'll go through them very briefly. The one is the employment tax incentive, which was introduced in South Africa in 2014. And this was a rare example where actually Jim Levinson and others did an RCT, proved that this model worked, and in fact that its effects persisted after the program was implemented. It's effectively a wage subsidy for unemployed young people in South Africa. And it was taken up. They were able to persuade government. It was put into legislation. In 2015, the ETI was rolled out, and it still exists today. But there have been many subsequent evaluations which have very mixed results. Most of them show statistically insignificant impacts. And yet we've spent about 15 billion rand per annum on the program since 2014. It still exists today. And I think this is probably a bad example. You've got an RCT. It's got this thrilling result. Everyone gets very excited. You roll it out, and at scale, you actually don't see the effects you expected. And in the intervening period, we haven't done enough to test adjustments and iteratively adapt that policy to kind of bring it up to speed. You then have, most other cases where there's no RCT, either because there just isn't one, or there isn't time, or the president has announced it already. And a good recent example, again in the South African context, is the introduction of the Social Relief of Distress Grant, which is a new social grant that we rolled out in 2020 in response to COVID. And of course, this was born of necessity because in March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, we had to implement a grant for unemployed working age adults who had no other form of support. And it was announced, and sort of 3 weeks later, we had to reach these people. And I think, the impact of that grant has been phenomenal. It's now reaching 9 million South Africans every month. Our estimates suggest it's lifted 3.7 million people above the food poverty line. But it was literally conceived and implemented in a period of 3 weeks with no, just based on what we could do at the time. The challenge of that, and I think really the key point here, is that once a policy exists, once a grant exists and 9 million poor people are receiving it every month, you can't undo it. Yeah. You have to work within the reality that now exists. And so, for example, we would like to, and many people have suggested, changes to the grant that would, for instance, reduce the number of beneficiaries but increase the value of the grant, or target the grant at a household rather than an individual level. And perhaps in theory, those kinds of versions of the grant are worth thinking about and worth testing. But in practice, it would be politically suicidal to reduce the number of people on the program. And so you have to rather focus your effort and your resources on testing adjustments to the grant within the frame of what is politically possible. So we're working now on testing, you know, a lump sum payment rather than regular transfers to the same number of people, those sorts of adjustments that you can conceive of as being realistically possible. I think the lesson there is, you know, often we don't take into account the impact of economic policy changes on the political economy and the political equilibrium, that actually it may make a lot of sense to have fewer people and a larger grant value. But if the impact of that on the political and social environment were so destructive or destabilizing, that it might actually have even worse consequences taken together. And the last example, also a recent one, is the massive expansion of public employment in South Africa in the last 3 years, also in response to COVID, where in 2020 we implemented the school assistance program. It now places about 300,000 school assistants in 26,000 schools in South Africa every year for a 12-month placement. And again, it was implemented in a matter of weeks, and the only reason it was implemented was because we were instructed to massively expand public employment, and we looked around and said, you know, who could absorb all these people? And you have schools, the infrastructure exists, they exist in every single district and ward in the country. They reach every corner of the country. And so, you know, here are a bunch of institutions that if you put 10 people in each, they can absorb it. The infrastructure exists. There was no other rationale for that program. And again, it now exists. You've got to do something with it. And there's been a lot of really excellent work since by South African researchers to tweak and optimize that program. So for example, an RCT last year, which the results will come out hopefully soon, which tested a simple intervention, giving those teacher assistants training and materials to help with alphabet learning in grade R and grade 1 level, with playing just a series of games to improve letter reading and recognition. And it cost very little, but I mean, the results are dramatic. It showed an improvement by 40% in alphabet, you know, understanding of the alphabet and letter reading by the end of grade 1. And so again, you're working with the grain, if you like, working with making adjustments within those programs and within the realm of what is possible and in the direction that policy makers are already going, I think has had really useful effects. And that's, I think, a way of doing this that can work.
Okay, thank you very much. You had the question, Eric? Yeah. And let's get some more hands. If there are any, then we move. But you don't have to. Okay, if we go there then after. Yeah.
Great. I was thinking about stepping stone effects. And I was actually thinking of Eliana's talk, that maybe a small step, in some ways it's good because it's easier to make the small step than the big step. On the other hand, you might get stuck in the middle with the small step. So I was thinking that also when Nomvuyo was talking about make the private sector electricity generation. Maybe once you've done that, then it's going to be harder to. Right. And so I'm wondering your thoughts on the process. Should you try and do a big step, and build your political capital and make a big step at a time, or do you make small steps that you hope that will then strengthen the actors that are going to push for the next step?
Okay, so let's collect some questions there, and then we have a trio there, I think, of hands.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I don't have a question, I have more comments. You said those were allowed. So I think the first comment I had was, yes, so my experience with research grants that I have received, indeed, a lot of them have had that component where you have to justify the policy implication of the work. And then in many cases also, to help you to be able to do that better, there has always been a focus on training of researchers, particularly economists, on how to translate the knowledge in a way that the policymakers will understand. Because we get the feedback that things tend to be too technical, they don't understand what we are saying, and so therefore there's that barrier to even uptake and use of the research. Now, I didn't know that the tides have turned. And now the focus is on training the policymakers in econometrics. I am interested to see how that works out. So I found that to be interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Stefan. I think that the point about the missing data that Andrew also raised is certainly a critical one. It's an important one. And sometime last year, I think JPAL tried to take a very direct approach to that. They came to the University of Ghana and they put policymakers and then researchers in a room. So the policymakers said what their interests were, what they wanted to do, what types of questions were of interest to them. And then the researchers also, were able to say what was allowable with data, what types of methodology they could use to answer these questions. At the end of the day, they came away with a handful of questions that were of relevance and then of potential solutions that could be gotten from the researchers. So I think that was, I don't know how much they intend to scale this up or do, I don't know, but it seemed to have been a very interesting and useful session. The point on political trust, I think Prof. Aryeetey even downplayed it a little, because sometimes not only are the policymakers, maybe they don't take your research into account or they are not interested. Oftentimes there's a concern that if your research is particularly, if it goes against what the policymaker wants to see or the reigning government is interested in, you can actually face potential backlash. A few years ago, I did have a colleague who released some research that wasn't well received and was, telling us he had to hire personal protection because he feared that there might be significant backlash. So that also is a barrier that, we have to contend with. And then I like the point about attribution. So a lot of the funders would also tell you at the end of your project, let us know what policy impacts you have had. I don't know what else was happening that contributed to this policy. I don't know if it's because of my research or it would have happened anyway. And just because at the end of my project, there has not been any change or any new policy, doesn't mean that a few years down the line, combined with other factors, there will be something that comes out. It is so difficult when, we are charged with these types of show us the policy impact. So I liked the point also about attribution that was raised. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll move to there's three in a row. Someone starts.
Okay, I'll start. So I was thinking about the tendency to announce the policy and then work out the details and how that can be reconciled with research. But Stefan, you also made the point that it's all about implementation. And so I think that's where we can really go in to do the research at the phase. Often there's a pilot phase or a smaller phase in which the policy is announced. They're going forward. There's all the details to be worked out. Some of the most interesting research questions are there. And there's going to be a pilot made. Then the benefit of going in at that point, I think, and really collecting the data collectively with the government, having them see the data at every stage, and then see the results of the pilot and then use that for implementing the rest of the policy. This is my hypothesis, is at least what we saw in Zambia, is that it has this spillover effect of the learning mindset that you were talking about and how crucial that is. So I'm thinking that maybe that's a way in which a stepping stone type of methodology that Eric was talking about would actually not crowd out the larger thing, because it would create this multiplier effect of learning. And we did that in Zambia with the community health assistant, the community nurse project at the pilot stage, and now it's been nationally scaled, 10 times as many as there were in the pilot. the amazing thing is, even once the government changed some policy that was not as focused on HR, because the WHO had made that best policy after the scale-up, now the government of Zambia was more committed to it because of the international effect. So it created this learning effect, which I think has a real opportunity for all of us at that initial stage.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Okay, thank you very much for the lofty, relevant thoughts so far. I just wanted to add some few comments. I think one way out of this gap or this lacuna that we can see between policy actors and academics, I noted here that we could be a step ahead in terms of looking at what the future is likely to hold in terms of problems. And I will take 2 instances. There was someone who presented yesterday on the issue of climate change, and she said she started talking about climate change when it hadn't become an issue. And because of that, today she's somewhat relevant and so relevant about the issue. I also had an experience when the MDG goals were everywhere. And one of my professors just stimulated us in the master's class then. That was sometimes in 2010, 2009, and mentioned the issue of sustainable development, that he can see the future for sustainable development that is going to be an issue. And in my own medieval way, I just wrote a piece on sustainable development and just sent it somewhere. As in, today when I read it, I'm like, what did I write? What's the meaning of this? As much as it made little or no sense, it is the most cited paper today. Because I just talked about what was going to happen in 2015. So I think we can be a step ahead by envisaging what is going to happen like in the next, that can be a big issue, looking at the trend of things. And then before even policymakers begin to get into that space, we can begin to anticipate the future and begin to talk about it. Like in Nigeria now, food security and exchange rate is a very big issue. So when we start seeing the big companies going out of Nigeria and folding up and getting out, we should anticipate that the exchange rate will come, there will be crisis. And I can imagine if we had started talking about it as at then you can begin to make a difference in the policy space. Then I noted that we should engage the policy actors getting out of the box as academics. Beyond the papers, sitting down to write the lofty papers and all that, we should try to engage them formally and informally. Mm-hmm. For instance, there's a project we're doing on farmer headers clashes, and talking now, I can see that we have engaged the affected people, that's the farmers, but we are yet to engage the stakeholders well enough. They are so much interested in the subject matter, but we are yet to understand their own dimension of the issue. And I'm already saying the need for that, so that when we're coming up with our dissemination, there will be no space, there will be no lacunas. Even if there is, there will be a synergy somewhere, and a better synergy after the results. So I think we should begin to engage them. Then another thing I think we should do, because I've seen someone do that in Nigeria, is we can get into the political space, if it permits us. She was trying to promote green cities, and then her husband, I think her spouse, was in the politics, and because of that, she was able to navigate the political space very easily and influence policy towards the greening of Lagos State. So once we begin to engage with them formally and informally, we know their games, we know how they play it, we can play along with them, we can talk to them formally and informally, and then we can push through these things. Thank you.
Excellent. So Chris has a question there. So, yeah.
Okay, just a quick comment and a question for Ernest, a comment on Stefan. So that was fascinating, and thinking about using behavioral economics to think about how to influence policy, it actually makes me uncomfortable. I have never felt sufficiently confident about a piece of policy advice to want to try to influence a government official to pay attention. But I think that's probably a privilege of being a scatterbrained academic, not a head of chief economics of DFID. And so this is my question for Ernest. I don't actually have a desire for my research to be directly influencing policy so much. I've always sort of relied on you, or Robert, or other economists who are in the country to talk with me or read my work and translate it where appropriate into policy advice. But now thinking about that, I've been thinking that for decades. Thinking about it now, that's sort of putting an unfair burden on you, and I don't know how you feel about that.
I can give you an answer.
Shall we add one question in this round? Is there one at the back there? And then
a couple of people on
this.
Side.
I didn't quite see the hands going.
Esther
Esther as well.
Shall
we just keep on, because a lot of them are comments, and then we can have, it's much better for the room, I think. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask if DFID, I know it's in the past tense now.
Yes, it's long gone.
Is it an extractive institution or an inclusive institution?
Oh, wow.
Excellent.
Is MIT and Yale and Princeton and Harvard and LSE inclusive institutions or extractive institutions? And the reason I'm asking this is because, so my name is Michael Sachs, I'm at Wits University, and I was formerly in government here in South Africa, and I'm a macro person. And earlier on in the session, earlier on today, somebody spoke about development economics and how back in the day, in the 60s and the 70s and 80s, when it was genuinely radical, it confronted macroeconomic questions. It confronted the issues that are really important for poverty, such as international macroeconomics, trade and development, structural reforms to economies, and many others that we can talk about, political economy. And as far as I can see, over my observation is that over the last 20 years, it has completely shifted away from that, and it is now concerned with projects. And as far as I can see, Abhijit Banerjee was showing us last night how much poverty has reduced globally in the last 30 years. But as far as I can see, that has very little to do with projects and much to do with the rapid acceleration of economic growth in China and other East Asian countries. And in that context, I just find an incredible degree of extrospection, by which I mean the opposite of introspection. So the first day, or the first 2 days here, we've been talking about they and them all the time. They and them being the poor people that we are helping. And now in this session, they and them is now no longer the poor people, it's the governments in Africa who have these problems. And we have to kind of use mind tricks on them to convince them of what we know, because we are the ones who know what the answers are. And I find this combination something worth introspecting about. Let me stop.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. It's another form of uncomfortability. Anyway, if anyone on this side of the room wants to comment on that as well, Esther wants to comment, then we'll come back here to the front, okay? Yeah, Pascaline and here also Tadel.
Yeah, maybe I'll do a bit of self-serving introspection. I think the straw man of the researcher who is evaluating something and finding the truth and going and trying to convince the policymaker, that's not how I see my job in any case, and that's not how I see the practice of anybody here, many of us having been involved in policy dialogues for quite a long time. So I think it's maybe building upon Nava's description of what happened in Zambia. I mean, it is just not how it works. Like, maybe it was in someone's pipe's dream that this is how it would work, but this is not how the policy, and I want to kind of take strict. We are not extractive, I hope so. But I think, it's better to talk about policy collaboration, and there are ups and downs in this collaboration depending on both the people involved on both sides. But it's never, it's just not, so in a sense, all of these insightful comments, they are commenting on someone's view of what the relationship between research and policy works, but not the one I know about. Like, in the sense that you take Tamil Nadu, where I've been working for a while. We've been in a partnership with the government of Tamil Nadu for like 20 years. And in 20 years, many things happened. Governments have changed, our partners have changed, researchers have come in and out. Ambitious projects have been done, very not ambitious projects have been done, have been success, failures, whatever, but it never followed that line. So I'm not exactly sure what we are talking about when it's like, oh, you are like coming, and it just, because that's not what it is. That's one first thing. And the first thing is to me about the them. So I have personal experience doing this policy dialogue in various countries, including France. And France is such a harder country to work with in terms of convincing policymakers. It's much more difficult. And maybe this is what you were describing about Boris Johnson is, there I feel them more with the policymaker vis-à-vis us. Like, where it's much more difficult to kind of be on a common platform of what we are trying to do. I feel and so I don't know whether this is just France or this is richer countries where ideology is actually, I feel, much more of an issue. And rent-seeking is not absent. And on balance, it's, so I think I thought it was worth adding to.
Thanks. I wanted to talk a little bit about the political risk. So I think if we go to evaluate the Hustlers Fund in Kenya and ask the government, hey, how about you share the data and we can look at stuff. Obviously, there's a huge risk for the government because if the evaluation ex post shows that actually the repayment rate is not, is so low that it's not what the program is intended to be, or that they may just not be happy at all with the results, right? And so they may just not be willing to share the data altogether. And so I think that's why in practice there's a little bit more of what Esther is saying is not there, which is a little bit more of researchers, doing stuff in a little corner of somewhere, kind of on their own, because it's the public good that we are providing, that we're experimenting and taking the risk to try things that fail without bringing with us in the failure politicians who may not want to have that, that record, right? So I think we need a bit of both in some sense. Like there are some true, out of the box things that no policymaker will be willing to try, even at a small scale, just because it's just too it's too out of the box, and they'll be like, no, I'm going to be penalized by the electorate if they ever know I did that. And so when we do these things on the side, we bring the funding, we do it, with all the ethical guidance that we are supposed to follow. And I think there's nothing bad about that. But I think what's true is that then, the idea that maybe we can translate those findings into action, which I think, in fairness, Esther, that was the first motto of Poverty Action Lab, was translating research into action. I think we've moved away from, believing that this can be done easily, but this was the initial motto. And that's where it's... Yeah. Yeah, so but that's where it can be more difficult, but that's also so I think we need both. But what the issue of how to deal with partnering with governments when the willingness to showcase findings is going to be a function of how positive the results are. Is something that was not discussed too much, but that I think is a serious question as well.
Right. Oh, there's lots more. Okay, we're going to take these three, and then we're going to Ghana. So Robin, and I'll go to Dabalen, and now we go to the back.
I'll be very, very brief, but I just kind of going back to what Esther was saying. My experience is that it's a kind of just a huge number of interactions, partly to get the research done, and then little bits of stuff appearing and some sort of story appearing. But I think, this is where I want the panel to comment, I think the principal value is that you get another set of information which is then in front of you in government, and you can decide, do I take into account that information or not? It's not that, and because there's been a lot of interaction, because you're doing the research often with the government, then it may be listened to or not. But I just wanted to kind of understand whether that's, I've always viewed that as a principle, you can take it or leave it. It's the more information in the world that could or might not figure into decision making. But that seems quite valuable because the academic credentials of the research makes it sort of seem more impartial, et cetera. But I'd be interested whether there's any agreement about that in the panel.
So Tadela, and then we go to the back. So here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a brief remark. Yesterday and today we have seen and heard in several micro-level evidence. So I was wondering to what extent this massive micro-level evidence have shaped the macro policy thinking and the macro policy, given your experience working with government policymakers. Thank you.
And then go to the back.
Thanks. I had a couple of comments. I think one that has not been mentioned here, and has a little bit to do with the interaction of micro and macro, is that in general, I think it's really hard for people to think in terms of counterfactuals, right? So if you evaluate a policy and you show the effects, but overall in the macro level, people are not seeing that like kids are at school, education is improving, or like health is improving, or crime is going down, or the economy is growing. Even if you tell that this small program like generates a positive effect, it's going to be really hard for the government to translate and interact with the citizens in a context where you have to win elections and things like that, right? So this is where like, kind of like the micro vis-a-vis the macro thing really plays a role. And you see like every day where you evaluate a policy, people say, oh, this policy created X number of jobs, but the economy is not growing, right? Even though that was true. So how do you interact with citizens and policymakers? I think that's kind of a challenge. There's number one. The second, which is kind of more wearing my hat as a political economist, I think one of the things that is generally not discussed is that many policies will have winners and losers. And when we think about, I don't know, say an education reform or a health reform that we think is going to increase the quality, but in order to do that, you're going to say have to put the teachers to work more, or you're going to monitor the nurses or whatever it is. there's going to be a backlash, right? The unions are going to go against, et cetera. So it goes back a little bit to this idea of what Dercon and Jim talked about in terms of anticipating the political effects. But it's a little bit more than that, because not only the political effects, it's understanding who are the winners and losers of a policy and trying to anticipate that maybe you need to compensate, or you need to anticipate who are going to be the losers, and maybe create a dialogue and interact and compensate and things like that, right? And I don't think we do that enough.
Okay, so I'm going to, would you like to start?
I'll start. And I think there was a direct question in the end there. So that's a very interesting point, and it's something that we tried to get a handle on right at the start of the reform agenda. So are you going for gold everywhere? Are you starting with the most difficult reforms? Are you starting with smaller ones and building momentum? When we were looking at the raising of the licensing threshold, at the time the debate was actually around, should you lift it from 0 to 10 or 0 to 50? And I think what the modeling exercise was able to help us do is actually get it to 100. A year later, once you've crossed that hurdle, then it was completely removed. So we weren't thinking about it explicitly as a stepping stone, but it ended up certainly being one. And I think what we have found most effective in our space, and I think it touches on some of the issues around you know, how you get things done on the ground. If you're starting from Andrew's point, which is that everyone here actually wants to make change on the ground. We're not just producing things for our own, you know, satisfaction. Then you have to think of the policy process as being circular, and you have to think of it as being multi-stage. So it's about how do you get research into policy? How do you get policy implemented in the way that you intended? And so part of what could happen is that you could think about circles of collaboration that have policymakers in one loop and researchers and civil society in another loop, government and civil society in another, and try and build coalitions that way. So we found that to be very helpful. We have a National Energy Crisis Committee where we have everyone from researchers to policymakers to actual people implementing on the ground. Business is a big vocal component of that, and we find that makes the political conversation easier, because now suddenly you've already built this big constituency, everybody has access to the same information, and everybody you can kind of shepherd in a similar direction. So I think thinking about it as being not a linear relationship, and thinking about how do you create as many ins at every stage of the way has been very useful for us.
Very good. Andrew.
So my mic doesn't work, so I'm going to try. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So, you know, I like, what kind of steps should you take? You know, I think building from a small step is helpful because you also try and build trust. Okay, because this whole thing is really about, you know, do these people trust you? If you basically say, oh, you know, you should go for the big thing, but they're really not willing to go there, they will just ignore you. Right, so I would think that in fact it's better to just if you start small and you're both learning together, sort of like collaboration as Esther was saying, right? So you're both learning, and you know they have an objective function. There's a place they want to go, and you say if you want to go there, these are some of the things that you can sort of, I don't know. Like you kind of play the role of a coach and an athlete, so something similar to that, right? So that way, I think you kind of build trust, and then you can, as Anava was saying, you could actually start building something bigger along the way, right? And also, Nomvuyo was saying. So that's all I can say about that. Now, if they want to go big, which is the opposite of what you, then you have to kind of break that down and say, if you want to go big, these are some of the things that need to be done. I mean, so you kind of have to work along with them, because I think that's the only process. It's a process. Now, political risk, yeah, there is going to be a political risk. I don't think you can avoid that, right? But if you want to engage and you want to influence and you want to collaborate, you can't avoid the risk. The world in which you you can work without risk is in policy is just I don't think exists, right? So you kind of have to live with that risk and figure out a way, what are your options to try and minimize that risk. But I don't think you should expect no risk at all, personally. Happens all the time. And on take it and leave it, that's a choice you can make. But then that also means you have to live with the fact that if you really, really think that your idea is brilliant and that it will be nice to have this and that it has huge consequential, impact, then it may not be implemented, right? So that's just, those are choices one has to live with. So for Esther, I think maybe it was the World Bank speak of saying, when I talked about engagement, it was the World Bank speak of saying, this is something that is just a process, engaging. Engaging means not saying, oh, you should do this. It's more like, hey, let's learn together. And, along the way, they're going to make mistakes. The researchers are going to make mistakes, but along the way, we'll collect data and learn. I mean, I think to me, the most important thing is learning. You can start somewhere, but along the way, you should just learn as long as you implement. So that, to me, is the most important thing. And collect that data. That's important. Because unfortunately, I don't see a lot of learning in this project, this implementation of these projects and policies. And that is something absolutely crucial for success. But I don't see a lot of it. And if we can really build a culture of learning in development implementation, I think we can really, really improve policymaking a lot.
Thank you very much. Let me, Chris, I have a perfect answer for you. But let me come to it in a very convoluted manner. One of the things that have been quite obvious to me over the years has been the fact that it's not simply a division between policy making and research. On the policy making side, there are different actors. And then on the research side, also, there are different actors. But these actors on the research side, you can put into two categories. The local researcher and the international researcher. Somehow, the development partners have positioned themselves as intermediaries between these entities. And so, and this answers also Esther to some extent. Your work at IPA may not be directly intended to lead to a policy outcome in Ghana. But then enters DANIDA, enters FCDO, enters CIDA, and says, are you aware of what IPA did in Ghana that has relevance for your education policy? Are you aware of that? And it's a very good report, and I recommend it to you strongly. That's how you come in. So you didn't go looking for the Ghana government to do what you said, but DANIDA said it for you. And that's important. When a young Ghanaian economist goes to the Ministry of Education and says something different, say, DANIDA says this. This is what IPA says. And so we do what IPA says because there's money behind it. That's how things have shaped over the years. Now I come to you, Chris. So the way we have worked with you over the years has been different in the sense that here was Chris, a young American researcher looking to understand Ghana, northern Ghana from the beginning, and wanting to work with local people to do it. So you find local people, and you work with them. They learn from you, and you learn from them. That's a partnership that goes over 30 years, right? It's about 30 years of that partnership, yes. So you never went to the Ghana government and said, look, I have this idea about rainfall insurance or something. No, you never went to anybody. But you worked with Ghanaians that learned how to do it and began to market the idea to insurance companies. So, in my view, whatever influence you've had in Ghana or in northern Nigeria or wherever, didn't come from selling some idea. It came from capacity building. And that's one thing that has been absent in many of our engagements. I believe that you've provided an almost perfect model of how research capacity building should be done. You build institutions, you build individuals, and those individuals then try to influence policy. Robert, with whom you've been working quite a bit lately, is a very strong actor in policy making in Ghana. The government listens to him. Whether they do what he's saying is a different matter, but they do listen. So that's the kind of relationship I believe that we should be looking at. USAID through Dean. Dean knows the kind of things that we've been doing. Dean is influential. Dean is going to be able to put across ideas. So these kinds of discussions are not at all unimportant. They are. They are in a sense. So I expect, Dean has done that. When Dean comes together and says, Ernest, I'm in town, shall we talk? Shall we have dinner? We do talk. And I expect those kinds of discussions to influence his engagement with the Ghana government. And I hope you'll be doing it.
Right. So I think we're going to run out of time. Let me comment on one or two things as well. So it's an interesting thing on the DFID as an extractive institution. I'm very happily have a further chat on it. But I mean, there is, but I want to pick that up together with the kind of uncomfortability of what Chris is referring to. Yeah? And I will come back in a moment to the strawman that Esther suggested there. So it is very clear that, I mean, definitely something I've learned, and in a way what you describe, that within the system, clearly as researcher, we should be as careful as possible and as truthful as possible. And there's no bound to that. There is no compromise to that. You be as carefully as truthful as possible. So my answer to you, Chris, is to say, well, you probably need people that engage in a dialogue that are the brokers, like you're saying. You're actually describing the evidence brokers maybe in that context. Maybe it's wrong that it's an outside donor and it's not you personally that is being trusted. And that you put me down and saying that I still walk around. I don't have millions of pounds anymore in my pocket. I've been out for 2 years. But there is there I thought they wanted to listen to me. But anyway, you have something. But there is an element of brokering. What I worry about, and maybe as to this is what you experience in France as well, sitting more deeply in the British system for a while, suddenly the dark forces are all around you. And actually, there's some pretty dark forces there. And actually, there is a real naivety for the ones that actually try to be as carefully as possible with evidence-based stuff relative to others. Why I said this kind of behavioral thing is I'm thinking not necessarily every single researcher needs to become trying to be Marlboro Man or something, but actually just know that's what the tricks they're using on us. I mean, the worst that I always found, that you would find suddenly meetings where ministers were talking to, and that's whether in your countries or whether it's in the UK, these kind of policy entrepreneurs, the ones who've dreamt up the new innovation. And there was one particular one on private education that I didn't realize afterwards was running an entire company that was trying to get things and was trying to praise that all should be not low cost, but high cost private education in Africa is the solution, and so on. These people get an audience. So I'm more saying, like, look, if we want to be more carefully and truthfully trying to present the evidence, we can't just be too naive that the people we interact with are actually simply absorbing it. So anyway, I still believe in my windows of opportunity, understand the entry points, and that the way we present and the way we talk about it will matter. But of course, it has to be in the truthful thing. But it's an interesting thing, and I want to then come on Esther's point on the straw man, whether I do have it. In a way, I don't think you know, in a way, I think you were implying there are constraints here. And, you know, Tamil Nadu is great. And we see over, you know, we can go back to the 1980s where Tamil Nadu was already doing more evidence-based stuff around nutrition and things like that than probably any Indian state. And so coming into that, you know, we have partners, we have IAS officers, we have right people to actually work with. And of course, this is done very benign. I would say I had that experience in Ethiopia for 15 years, where there's actually clearly, you know, committed people in the ministries that actually want to do reasonable things. I'm looking around, the Ethiopians are not going to contradict me, hopefully, but there were reasonable people you could work with, and they actually, and it's an interesting thing, it was not a perfect society in all kinds of ways, but developmentally, it was actually, you could do a lot of progress. You know, Bangladesh is mentioned by Mushfiq before, and you have these places where you can work. But it's not the experience I've had on certain areas around, you know, agricultural policy in Malawi. It's not the experience I have. You know, my terrible experience was then writing little papers over months and trying to get a dialogue with the Minister of Agriculture and trying to explain how food security was undermined by the way that we're doing not just the fertilizer subsidy policy, but also how all the disincentives for private storage, to then discover that my paper, that the guy was then arrested 6 weeks later for exactly the corruption I had described that probably is encouraged by the nature of the policy. And this was Mr. Chiponda. He's now ready to be standing for president. But it's an interesting thing that, you know, you do get in certain sectors and certain places. You know, whether I'm on the right side of it, I don't know. But there are places where it is just much harder. And we can't just be naive, as I was, writing little papers, working with IFPRI, and then thinking they will listen to me if I keep on being nice and give him time. No, it was absolutely not. Now, I'm not saying Malawi, therefore you can't work it, but there are these kind of things. And I think if we don't take that into account, we may not maybe make progress. I don't have an answer what I do in agricultural policy in Malawi, but it is definitely something. And then finally, I think, you know, this was a lot of good questions and good answers. I'm not going to try to, there's several points made, but I think we should do it at the wine estate now, and because we're running out of time. So I would thank you. I will want to go and ask privately to Dean whether any of his experiences, because he was quiet. Actually, Dean, can you tell me your good and bad experiences in that broker role where you're clearly now sitting in USAID? Say something. Huh? No. Just say something, because you're sitting in that position, and I don't know, maybe my impression is very different, and how you see to work. There's a microphone there.
So I'll just be very brief, and just to say this was a fascinating set of inputs, and for what it's worth, I think USAID struggles on exactly these issues because we are one removed. So I hear some of these very conversations, but like with an extra layer of in between. So I certainly haven't seen a USAID with a model, but you know, it's people in the missions that are then engaging with some policymakers, but that's not, USAID doesn't do government to government much, very limited. And so there's talk of that, but it's like everything we're describing here with extra people in the middle who aren't fully bought into either side. So it's not, it's not very useful. This was very useful though for me to listen to. So thank you, everybody.
It's very good. I think I would take the one big conclusion, we need to keep on talking to them. Dialogue, that's probably the one that we all agree on, and we keep on talking to policymakers. How we do it, we can unsee them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.